About 13 years ago, when my time had ended in Kentucky, and I had to move to Georgia, I signed up for the next safety brief at my local auto skills shop. A few minutes into the brief, the elderly, white-haired master mechanic glanced at me in the crowd, and he smiled. He gestured toward the ground with his grease-stained fingertips and exclaimed, "The floors ain't sealed, but if you spill oil, it's okay. You just have to know how to dance." Welcome, friends. In this episode, I'm conducting maintenance on the transmission and transfer case of the WJ. In episode 3, I swapped out the motor mounts for the vehicle, and I figured that the transmission mount was also necessary to limit or reduce vibrations in the cabin. I watched a DIY where a person lifted at the transmission pan to replace the mount. I did this also, but if I were to do it again, I would lift at the bell housing or the transfer case, or just put a big block of wood underneath the transmission pan, which would spread out that load and prevent the pan itself from bending. After removing the pressure on the transmission mount, I used a 16mm socket and swivel joint to remove all 4 bolts connecting the mount to the transmission. Then I adjusted the height of the drive line using the jack and unbolted the cross bolt using a 18mm socket and wrench. It was out with the old and in with the new, but I wasn't paying attention at all, and I didn't realize that the transmission mount isn't flat. The mounting surface is stepped, so it needs to be oriented correctly to bolt on properly, and I messed it up the first time. After fixing it, I tried putting it back together with some blue Loctite, but I ran into an issue with the new mount that I bought on rockauto.com. The welded support on the mount is in the way of one of the bolts, so I could not fit the socket onto the bolt head, and I had to use a wrench to tighten it down the rest of the way. I am 100% certain that this is a manufacturer defect, and it made me wish that I would have just bought a pre-installed poly bushing mount instead of being cheap and going with Rock Auto. The transmission pan was leaking, so I knew I needed a new gasket. But when I was getting ready to unbolt the transmission pan, I realized that there was a huge problem. The exhaust mount hanger had come out of the bracket and was resting on the transmission pan itself. I did not understand this at all, but when the vehicle was running, it was literally rubbing the hanger on the transmission pan. I figured that this had just popped out, maybe during a rear end impact, and I would simply need to unbolt the bracket, put it on the hanger, use a ratchet strap to reposition everything, and then bolt it all back together. This did not work. The whole exhaust was bent forward approximately 2 inches, and the hanger would not fit back onto the support bracket. So many things went through my head. First I thought, just buy a catback exhaust. But I realized that the bend part was actually attached to the cats, so I would have to buy new cats. But the whole thing was rusted, so it might be seized together, which means I would need to buy all new exhaust. I asked around on the forums and nobody replied, until I realized that it was way more simple than I was making it out to be. All I needed to do was cut off the hanger and reposition it later. When I originally cut off the hanger, I had not bought the welder yet, and I had planned on trying to use exhaust epoxy to put it back together. This was sketchy and I didn't think it would work, so it was part of the reason I decided to get the welder, because this way I wouldn't have to spend $1,000 on buying new exhaust. I bolted the bracket back onto the transmission and then used a ratchet strap to position the exhaust for welding. I had to grind down the hanger a bit since I decided to reverse the direction to make it all work. So the part that was welded to the exhaust became the isolated hanging part, and the part that was hanging got welded to the exhaust. I used the if you can't tie a knot, tie a lot method for welding on this, since it was thick material and I actually didn't have the welder set up properly for it. I'm certain that there wasn't enough penetration, but if it does come apart in the future, I'll definitely be able to fix it easily. When I was panicking about replacing the cats, I did a quick inspection and realized that the manifold to cat bolts were loose, so I tightened them up and then I sprayed that entire forward section with exhaust, primer, and paint since I wanted to protect my fresh weld anyway. I did brush off the loose rust and wipe it down with acetone, but I went pretty fast, so it didn't end up with the great finish after heating it up and cooling it down. I ended up having some peeling. Now that I had fixed the exhaust issue, I could finally get to servicing the transmission, starting with dropping the transmission pan. I used a 13mm socket to begin loosening the bolts. I was in the driveway, and that meant that the slope was toward the back of the vehicle, so I figured that the best way to drain the excess fluid was to remove all of the rear bolts and leave the front ones in, loosening them last to get as much fluid out as possible before actually having to drop the pan. At some point I realized that this was a mistake because the length of the pan was perpendicular to the slope, and because the internals didn't actually allow for me to get the pan to flex enough to drop the fluid out. So I grabbed an extra bolt and decided to change my drain orientation to drop on the driver's side. I thought that I had secured the passenger side, the extra bolt that I put in there, but it became apparent that I only threaded the bolt into the gasket and not into the actual transmission itself. So if I had to do this again, I'd put a tarp underneath it, then an absorbent pad, and then the metal pan, and then the oil pan before dropping the transmission. I've done transmission services several times before this, so it was definitely a shock that I could have messed up so bad, but I just had to acknowledge the mistake and move on. The next thing I needed to do was replace the transmission oil filter using a T20 Torx bit. And when I put in the new one, I did not torque it to spec. Since I didn't have a 1/4-inch torque wrench, I just tightened it wrist tight before cleaning up the pan and the mating surface and installing the new lube blocker gasket, which they do sell for this transmission. It's just under Chrysler instead of Jeep. I torqued the bolts down to 25 foot-pounds using the specified order on the lube blocker packaging. And when everything was tightened to spec, I filled up the transmission starting with 4 quarts of AMSOIL synthetic ATF. I ended up using about 5.5 quarts after actually driving the vehicle. Unfortunately, the new gasket didn't help, and I was still leaking oil. It looked like there might be a crack in the cast aluminum, and the pan bolts looked too long. But I had already verified that the pan bolts were all the same length, so unless the wrong bolts were in there to begin with, I figured it was just a tight clearance or the overdrive section shifted down somehow. I didn't want to panic, but I had to do something, so I ordered a new gasket for between the transmission proper and the overdrive section. I definitely recorded the disassembly of the drivetrain, but I made my biggest mistake in the series by leaving my GoPro stuck on my bumper with its magnetic mount. This was a huge low point for me, and I was pretty depressed about losing equipment as well as losing 4 to 6 hours of video. I spent 2.5 hours in the sun dodging cars, but I could not recover the SD card. So, story time. I removed the transfer case using a 14mm ratcheting wrench, dropped the transmission crossmember with an 18 and 15mm socket, and pulled off the overdrive section using various sizes of sockets, including a 12mm, 15mm, and 18mm socket to remove the bracket, reinforcement bars, and the bolts. Once I got the overdrive section off, I found a nice bit of metal in the oil passage and several more inside the overdrive section. After watching some YouTube videos, I figured out that this was likely some broken rings, which could be replaced easily. I pulled off the retaining ring and removed a few clutches inside the overdrive before the whole assembly jerked violently in my hands. I was terrified because all the videos I watched said that the interior assembly was pressed together, since there is an 800-pound spring in there, and that I should not mess with that section unless I'm a professional. After feeling brave enough, I used some needle nose pliers to undo the retaining snap ring and dropped out the interior assembly, and that's when I realized that there were several broken rings inside of this whole thing. One of them was the retaining ring that held in that 800-pound spring. There were just a few bits left holding the whole thing together. Now that it wasn't just a simple gasket job or not even a simple ring replacement, I had to get someone with a press to rebuild this for me or find another solution. eBay came to my rescue. This kit came with new clutches and a rebuilt interior assembly, so I ordered this right away. When it came in, I pulled everything out of the box and organized all the clutches and plates in the correct order based on the old ones that came out. There was still a problem though. I had read a review for the seller which stated that the rings and gasket came with the kit, but that review was for a different item sold by the seller, so I didn't realize that I would still need that new spring ring and gasket to complete the repair. The seller was awesome and got back to me right away, even though it was like 7:30 in the morning. He was willing to send me out the parts that I needed, but since I needed the Jeep on the road within a couple of days, he recommended calling a transmission shop locally. After a short trip to a local shop, a nice older gentleman was able to help me find a used spring ring, and I took it home for only $5. O'Reilly's was able to get the gasket in. I had to reorder it, and they got it in within a few hours. Now that I had all of the parts, I could start the reassembly by reinstalling the internal assembly into the overdrive housing. The new internal assembly does come with a half shaft inside of it. To keep all of the internal clutches and plates aligned, I would need to wait until the last minute to pull that out. I used an old pre-workout tub to rest the internal assembly on and drop the housing on top of it. Then I remembered to grab the new ring and start installing all of the rings, clutches, and the retaining ring on top of that. I did have a leak coming from the transfer case, but more importantly, the dash kept giving me a false indication for the four-wheel drive status, so I ordered a new sensor from O'Reilly's and swapped it out. I don't know the actual size for this, but I believe I was able to make my 38mm socket work, and then whenever I installed the new one, I tightened it only hand tight. It's not a high torque value for this. I went to re-clean the mating surface on the transmission when I noticed that there was actually a crack in the transmission housing. This is what caused the problem to begin with. I was pretty devastated considering all the work that I had already put in. I figured that my options were to buy a new transmission, take out the old one and have the crack welded, or just learn how to TIG weld aluminum overnight. I chose instead to go the easy route and just JB weld it. After some dremeling, the aluminum kind of brushed in on itself, and I was left with a pinhole and a Dremel groove to fill with JB Weld. I drained some tranny fluid to make sure that the area would stay dry, and then I Dremeled it, and once the Dremel was good to go, I filled in the gap with some JB Weld. I want to say that I let the JB Weld sit for about 3 hours before I started reassembly. I was pretty nervous that the JB Weld would prevent the overdrive housing from sitting properly on the mating surface, so I was very eager to get it back together and find out. I put a wee bit of RTV on the mating surface to make sure that the gasket didn't move around. Then I stuck the gasket on there and went to reinstall the overdrive housing. It was surprisingly difficult to pull out that half shaft that the new internal assembly shipped with, and I couldn't do it under the Jeep. I had to actually get out from underneath there, sit up to get enough leverage. Then I rolled back under the Jeep and slid it back on, trying to ensure that the parking arm on the driver's side aligned properly and moved the support brace out of the way. I wasn't able to get it on right away, and I thought it was the parking arm, but it was really just the internal clutches which had moved slightly after I pulled out the half shaft, and I had to wiggle everything just to get it on. Once it was flush, I could reinstall all of the bolts and torque them down to 25 foot-pounds using a crisscross pattern. When I went to bolt the transmission pan back on, I did realize that these bolts were definitely too long, only the ones that are directly underneath the overdrive section. So instead of cutting the bolts and risking rusty ends or messing up the threads, I grabbed some washers from a Dorman bolt washer and nut set and installed those in the rear of the pan. Next, I reinstalled the upper support arms to the overdrive section. I thought that these would be impossible to reinstall, but it wasn't too bad to reposition them, and I don't remember what torque spec I used, but I think I just used the torque wrench for leverage to get them around 35 foot-pounds. Before installing the Bracket, cables, and wiring. I needed to fix the transfer case cable bushing. The one on this cable was gone and the lever pin was freely wiggling inside of the cable ring. The right answer is to replace the entire cable, but that's very expensive, and the cheapest bushing replacement I could find was $35 for a direct replacement. But I refused to pay $35 for a tiny piece of plastic, so I watched a bunch of videos of people making cheap Amazon ones fit, and I thought that that would be better. It was not worth it at all. I spent an hour grinding and melting 2 bushings. I ended up destroying one of them, but I got the other one to fit kinda. Just pay the $35 for the one that fits. Next, I installed the bracket with a 15mm wrench and ratchet before aligning the transfer case studs and sliding it on, tightening down the nuts by hand first and then using a ratcheting wrench. There was no way for me to fit a torque wrench in there, so I just got them as tight as possible before struggling to get the bushing to fit onto the adjustment arm. Next, I reinstalled the transmission mount using a 16mm socket and torquing it to 50 foot-pounds. Then I reinstalled the cross member using a 15 and 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench, torquing everything down to 35 foot-pounds. After that, I reinstalled the front and rear drive shaft using a 8mm socket. Once the drive shafts were installed, I could fill the transfer case with the new fluid until it started dripping out. I did use AMSOIL fully synthetic ATF, and I reinstalled the plug. Mine took just over 1 quart to fill. I ran out of AMSOIL and I couldn't find it locally, so I used Valvoline fully synthetic ATF to refill the transmission and get the vehicle moving again. Next, I needed to install the transfer case skid plate that I pulled off a junkyard WJ. I did not grab the bolts, so I used some out of my Dorman bolt set. Everything did not align properly, so I did have to unbolt the crossmember and adjust everything to fit. But there was still a small issue since the transfer case was too low and it was actually resting on the skid plate. What's worse is that there was an awful grinding noise from the rear end. When I first heard it, I thought that I blew up the rear differential, but it turned out that it was the exhaust, which had been smashed, right, and it was moved forward 2 inches. It was rubbing on the rear upper control arm and making a racket. The cheapest and easiest answer was welding in a couple of inches of exhaust pipe, but there wasn't really any room since the muffler was so long. So I bought a muffler at AutoZone along with some piping and adapters and got busy lengthening the exhaust. I was very surprised that the connection at the muffler was not seized, and I was able to pop it off after cutting off the old rusted clamp. Next, I cut off the muffler from the rear section and I cut a bit of pipe so that the length with the muffler would be about 2 inches longer than the old muffler that I cut off. After test fitting and ensuring that the exhaust would clear the axle and the control arm, I tacked up the muffler and pulled it back off and then fully welded everything together. If you watched the last episode, you know that I bought a Titanium 200 Unlimited multi-process welder to use in the front axle. I was watching welding content on YouTube and I was getting a little nervous about how little content there was for the Titanium and how much content there was for the Vulcan OmniPro 220. Every pro welder review that I watched said that, the recent OmniPros were as good as or better than a Miller Multimatic. But they all also said that they would rather have a Miller for the shop due to the warranty and the reputation. I wasn't about to spend $4,000 on a hobby welder, so I looked into getting the OmniPro. It turned out that I could return the Titanium within 90 days without paying a restocking fee if I was upgrading. And I was able to use a 25% off coupon at the same time to get the OmniPro. So I was able to get an awesome digital 220 multi-process welder for much less than a quarter of the price of the Miller. I did spend way too long cleaning and repackaging the titanium like it was new, and I ended up seeing it later for sale at the store. The exhaust was hanging really low, and I thought it contributed to the transfer case sitting on the skid plate, so I decided to add a hanger to the forward exhaust clamp. I welded the new hanger onto the unibody and added the exhaust clamps, putting a single tack on the bottom of each of the connections to keep them from twisting. I figured I could simply grind them off if necessary in the future. The new muffler sounds like a raspy V8 at idle, but a bit of a ricer while under quick acceleration. One extra note on the exhaust was that I did have an exhaust leak at the forward clamp. The connection there was weird because the old pipe section that headed to the cats was an odd size. I bought all of the pipe adapter sizes from O'Reilly's between 1 3/4 and 3 inches, but nothing fit properly. The closest thing was the 2.5 inch adapter, and that was what I ended up welding onto the muffler, and then I clamped onto the old pipe. But the fitment, it just wasn't right, and I ended up having to weld the muffler to the forward section, but I kept the clamp on there because of the hanger. I had added 7 washers to the transfer case skid plate to create a spacer and prevent the transfer case from rubbing on the skid plate and, putting vibrations into the chassis. But I knew that I actually had to fix the problem. I didn't want to buy another crappy rubber transmission mount, and I was delivering the Jeep this week, so I couldn't wait for the really expensive made-to-order poly mounts. So I ended up following the DIY from Martinbuilt and installed poly bushings from Amazon. After pulling out the mount, I used a razor blade to cut out the rubber and then a jigsaw to cut the inner sleeve of the mount. I didn't have a proper bench or setup, so it took me a long time to knock out the sleeve using a chisel and hammer. Once I got it out, I made the bevel inside the steel mount and did several rounds of sanding down the exterior of the poly bushing to be able to press it into the mount straight. I really wanted to just cut the bushing in half, like every other bushing, polyurethane bushing that I've ever seen, and then just slide it in from either side, but it wasn't designed that way, and I didn't want to press my luck. So I finally got it together, greased up the sleeve and threw it in, and then I used taped washers, just like Martin showed in his DIY, for the install. The new mount raised the transfer case at least 1 inch and allowed it to properly clear the skid plate. Alright, so expenses for this episode should have just been the cost of oil and gaskets, but there was the overdrive repair, I replaced the transmission fluid a couple times, the new transfer case sensor was really expensive, and the poly transmission mount bushings I had to buy in a set of 2, which was also pretty expensive. The exhaust expense included the welded muffler, adapters, pipe, and exhaust primer and paint. So the episode total was $833, making the project add up to $9,514 to this point. The 17 hours of labor from this episode brings us up to 100 hours for the project so far. My first takeaway for the episode is to just always be careful when you're dealing with chemicals and oils. I should have double checked and made sure that the bolt was actually threaded into the transmission housing before loosening all of the other bolts. That would have ensured that I didn't leak oil all over the driveway, which meant that I had to use absorbent and then later use a chemical degreaser and pressure washer to pull the oil out of the concrete. My second takeaway is that aluminum is weak, and you need to be careful when torquing bolts on anything aluminum, whether it's a transmission, transfer case, or the engine. I was pretty horrified cleaning the overdrive housing and seeing how much wear gets on these things just in the aluminum. My next takeaway is to be careful what I'm buying cheap. Some things might be okay to buy cheap, but after seeing how quickly the new transmission mount failed, I'm second guessing the decision to buy OE style control arms. I'm hoping that those last at least 50,000 miles. My last takeaway is related to the welder and the exhaust. I tend to buy some more expensive things over less expensive things because I want them to be multi-purpose and I don't want to have to upgrade later. I just want to buy the one thing and be done. I wanted a multi-process welder so that I wouldn't have to buy several different welders. If I wanted to TIG later, I could just buy the right gas and learn to TIG. I wouldn't have to buy a whole separate thing. The titanium and Vulcan welders are both Harbor Freight, but they're big ticket items for me. And I'm glad I was able to use the 25% off coupon and return the titanium, not because it was a bad piece of equipment, but because the increase in duty cycle, features, and capability on the Vulcan was worth the small price increase, and it would enable me to just not have regrets later. Or think that, maybe I need to buy the Vulcan in a couple of years. All the money went into a single purchase. I'm glad that I was also able to put a new muffler on the Jeep. It fixed the issue, but I also learned a lot from doing that. I remember paying someone several $100s to weld on a couple of race cats onto my X5M after installing catless downpipes. The more practice I get welding, the better I'll get, and the less intimidating these things become. It's not some mysterious thing that I can't do, it just takes practice. Of course, I haven't tried TIG or aluminum or stainless yet, so we'll see what happens there. But that is it for this episode. Next time, I'll be working on the interior of the Jeep, which I did way too much on, and it dragged everything out because I didn't want to do the work to put it all back together afterward. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.